What's up, everyone? Welcome into DodgerHeads, presented by DodgerBlue.com. I'm Jeff Spiegel. I'm joined by Daniel Starkand. And by the time this runs, it's been about a week and a half since the Dodgers have won the World Series. Daniel, we are still World Series champions. In case you are wondering, the Dodgers have not ceded that crown. We are still basking in the glow of our first World Series of your life and my life. And you and I, it's the first time we've talked since post-game of Game 6. So I've got to ask, how have the last few days been for you?
It's been amazing, honestly. This smile on my face right now hasn't really come off at all. I mean, obviously 2020 has not been the best year, but the fact that we were able to get a Lakers championship and then a Dodgers championship has been pretty much the only good part. So the last week's been good. It's been nice to kind of get away from baseball a little bit. Like, there hasn't been a whole lot going on, and getting away from, Twitter and social media a little bit's always nice, especially like after the stress of the postseason. But yeah, feels great. The Dodgers, they're world champions, and I mean, we're thinking about next year, but at the same time, we're enjoying this one.
It's the first time we ended the season with a win, which you cannot underestimate how amazing that was. Obviously, that was a World Series win, not like a Game 162 win. So absolutely amazing. And, thankfully, I'll just throw this out there. There have been no news about positive tests with the Justin Turner fiasco, which has been good. Part of me wonders if maybe, even if there was, I don't think we'd be hearing about it, because any positive test that comes out would look bad on Turner. These guys aren't testing. But anyways, that story has seemed to die down, at least by the time we're recording this. So that's a good news. If you missed it, Matt and I recorded a show a couple days ago talking about just reliving the moments on DodgerBlue.com. We're counting down the top 10 moments from the postseason run. Matt and I did our top 10 heroes. Who are the guys you're going to remember? That was a really fun show. We also talked a little bit about awards, Mookie Betts winning the gold glove as well. So check that out if you missed it. But Daniel and I are going to look ahead now. It's bizarre because the Dodgers win the World Series on Tuesday. On Wednesday, they had a bunch of guys become free agents. The real world caught up with them. This past Monday was the start of free agency, but based on the numbers, things have been slow moving, so we're not expecting anything to happen too quickly, especially with baseball essentially having a normal length offseason, unique to them compared to basketball. Everything's going to be short. Baseball pretty much ended right about on time-ish. They're planning on starting the next year normal time. So let's start with the Dodgers and where they're at. The big news for the Dodgers post-World Series was a bunch of guys who became free agents. Pedro Baez, Kike Hernandez, Jake Mcgee, Joc Pederson, Justin Turner, Blake Trynan, and Alex Wood. You could add Jimmy Nelson to that list. He was a guy who was basically cut. They had the option to bring them back, and they didn't. The rest of those guys had just reached free agency. So as you think about that, obviously some big names. Justin Turner, the biggest one, a guy who's getting up there a little bit in age. Curious to see what happens with him. Pedro Baez, Kike Hernandez, some guys you're familiar with, maybe lesser players. And then you've got Joc Pederson, Blake Trynan, some interesting names there. So, Daniel, as you just think about that list, I mean, Turner's the headliner. Are there other guys on there that catch your attention?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like you said, it starts with Turner. So I'll start with him as well. I think that if there's one guy from this group that, in my opinion, needs to be brought back, it's Justin Turner. Let's put all that COVID stuff aside. But even as we've seen, some guys interviewing on different shows and stuff since they won it all. Every guy in that locker room, everyone in the Dodgers organization loves Justin Turner. Like, there hasn't been one guy that hasn't come to his defense. And I mean, it's been clear the last few years that he's kind of emerged as their team leader. And he still showed he's got a lot left in the tank. He's, getting up there in age at 35 or whatever, but he played excellent defense in the postseason. He was making some great plays, so he could still play third base for another year or two. So to me, he's the first guy. And then after that, I mean, they're all quality guys that all contributed to this World Series run. There's there are three relievers, I guess, if you add Alex Wood, but Pedro Baez and Blake Trynan were two of the biggest contributors in the bullpen. I don't know if they're going to be back. We'll have to see what the market looks like. We know the Dodgers don't typically like to spend big on relievers. So if I had to guess which guys would be back, for me, it would be one of Joc or Kike along with Turner. I'm not sure which one. Joc and Kike kind of serve different roles, kind of opposites, right? Yeah. Like, one's a lefty that hits righties and the other's a righty that hits lefties. And we know how many positions Kike could play all across the diamond. So for me, I think Joc would maybe be the guy to come back because he fits in nicely in a left field platoon with Pollock, whereas Kike could kind of be easily replaced on this roster. They have a lot of guys with versatility, with Chris Taylor. And then Gavin Lux is obviously coming up and should figure into the second base job next year. Zach Mckinstry is a guy whose name we heard, in spring training and stuff, and he could be on the way. So I think they have a lot more utility options as opposed to, starting left field options or like a natural platoon with Pollock, since we know he hits lefties and has kind of struggled against righties. So for me, if I had to choose one, it would be Joc. But he's probably going to get the most money out of everyone in that bunch. So we'll just have to wait and see, I guess.
Well, it's interesting to think about because I would argue that the decision about whether or not the designated hitter will be a permanent feature in the National League actually plays a massive role here. I would say starting with Justin Turner, because if there's no designated hitter, the decision to bring back Justin Turner means there's nowhere for Edwin Rios to play. And Edwin Rios is a younger guy that is starting to come into his own. Now, if you have the designated hitter, that opens it up. But I think you can make the same case for Joc Pederson. If there's a designated hitter, that increases his value. So that's a couple things to watch. But let me throw a couple numbers at you here, and you tell me if you're interested. I'm going to pull these from MLB Trade Rumors. They do a great job of ranking the top 50 free agents, as well as some honorable mention guys, and then making a projection for how much they're going to earn. Justin Turner, I'll play a game with you, actually. They've got a 2-year deal for Justin Turner. They've got him the 14th best free agent on the market this year. 2 years, what do you think? What dollar number are you comfortable with for Justin Turner at 2 years?
I saw the MLB Trade Rumors article, so I'm not going to spoil anything. For me, though, for 2 years for Justin Turner, I'd probably give him $25 million, 12 and a half a year.
Yeah.
Maybe the second year's a club option or something. But I mean, I don't know what the market is for third baseman out there right now. We know there's so many good third basemen in baseball at the moment. So I don't know how many teams are really looking for a third baseman and one at Turner's age at that. So I think you could get him on a team-friendly discount. We know he loves LA. He's from Long Beach. He went to Cal State Fullerton. Yeah. He does so much in the community. So I know he wants to stay with the Dodgers, and I know the Dodgers want to keep him. So for me, 2 years, $25 million, somewhere in that range would be perfectly fine for me.
Yeah, and MLB Trade Rumors has him to the Dodgers, 2 years, $24 million. So you're right there. I mean, I'll just throw this out there because I think it's interesting. I had a non-Dodgers friend text me after the whole COVID thing in the World Series and basically said, realistically, Turner's going to get suspended. I mean, the MLB most likely is going to drop the hammer on Justin Turner. And he threw out a number that seems crazy on one front. And then at other moments, I'm like, is that too low? I mean, a guy like Turner could be facing a suspension of 20, 30 games. I mean, like the MLB is going to hammer him. And so that's another piece that I think factors in. At some point, that news is going to break. And if you know that a guy has a 30-game suspension, that's probably going to benefit the Dodgers because they could care less about the first 30 games of the season, especially at a guy like his age. So I would expect the DH to be in play. And if that's the case, I think Turner's a priority. I think he's not going to shop himself around and try and squeeze every penny out of the Dodgers. I think they make that one work. So like you said, 2 for 24. And remember, Turner's been underpaid on the contract. Yes, it was a big contract that he signed. He has well outperformed that value, so I'm sure they want to help him out a little bit there. The next guy on this list is Joc Pederson, 18th best free agent. They've got him listed as a 2-year contract for $9 million a year. Now, what's interesting is you actually indicating you think, hey, there might be a chance. To me, Peterson's gone. I think he's just the guy. He is so much more valuable to another team than he is to the Dodgers. I think Peterson probably has a large part of him that thinks he's an everyday guy, and he knows as long as he's a Dodger, he's never going to be an everyday guy. Now, is there another team out there that thinks he's an everyday guy that says, hey, we're actually going to give you the at-bats in order to prove that you can hit lefties? I don't know, but for me, this was the easiest one as far as I think he's gone. The Dodgers tried trading him. The other guy they tried trading was Ross Stripling, who they then successfully traded later in the season. So 2 years, $9 million per year. That's too rich for my blood. If I'm the Dodgers, I'm hoarding all of my pennies to give to Corey Seager and to Walker Buehler and all the rest of these guys. Because, I mean, at the end of the day, we can think of the Dodgers as this absolutely massive, big market team, which they are, but we also know they operate within reason. They're not going to just go spend $200 million a year. So if you start looking and saying, well, they're paying Mookie, they've got to extend Seager at some point, they got to extend Bellinger at some point, and they got to extend Buehler at some point, in that order. Save the money, folks. Save the money and pay those 3 guys, please.
Yeah, yeah. Let me just be clear. I don't necessarily think Joc is likely to come back. Just
He's the
for
guy
me,
you
it
would
was.
want.
Yeah, well, he fills a role like they don't really have a set replacement as a left-handed
Yeah.
outfield bat to
Maybe
platoon with
Rios.
Apollo.
Like, I suppose
Yeah,
Rios.
maybe, but it wasn't as clear for me as like Kike. You could just
Yeah.
easily replace that with another
Yeah,
utility guy
that's
they
fair.
have. So that's why I said Joc could potentially be back. Or in my mind, like that would be the guy I would prioritize over Kike. But like you said, it's possible he gets a deal elsewhere where he could play every day, which is something we know obviously every player wants to
Yeah.
do. So I mean, if he gets that offer somewhere, I don't think he'd hesitate to go elsewhere. One thing I do think we need to keep an eye on though is just like the overall economics of baseball right now. We're not exactly sure how many teams are going to be spending money this offseason. So when you look at guys like Joc and Kike in particular, like if teams don't see them as everyday guys, which they haven't been on the Dodgers, then I don't think they're going to be getting those, 2 years, $18 million offer like you just said Joc is projected to get. So I think we could potentially see something like where if those guys don't get what they're looking for, maybe they come back to the Dodgers on like a bit of a ballooned 1-year deal and just kind of run it back with the same team and try to defend their title. And then, a year from now, maybe more teams are willing to spend. Maybe the pandemic's closer to over, the CBA's up, so that might be a much better time to hit free agency than this year. So maybe we see some of those guys back on 1-year deals.
Yeah, and I mean, when you're being generous when you say we don't know what teams are going to do, everything indicates they're not going to spend. Based on we're going to talk about a guy like Brad Hand who was cut, and any team in the league could have had him for $10 million. This is a guy who had like a 2 ERA and has been one of the best relievers in baseball. The Dodgers could have had him for the same amount they paid Blake Trinen a year ago and chose not to. So I think the indication is there as well. And one other thing I'll say, you brought up AJ Pollock. I still get the sense the Dodgers view him as an everyday guy. I mean, yes, he's much better as a platoon, but he is not nearly the platoon guy, and you weren't saying this, that a Joc Pederson is. Like, Peterson never hits versus lefties. Pollock has no problem hitting righties. He mashes. He's arguably the team's best hitter against lefties, but against righties, he can hit. He is competent. So, again, that's where it would be for me. So, number 3 on this.
Yeah, and real quick, thanks for bringing that up. I meant that more as like in the postseason or in like big games.
Yeah, Pollock was
like,
bad.
Throughout the regular season, AJ Pollock has proven to be an everyday guy. He led the team in home runs this year. Like he was one of their best hitters all year. So and I'm more talking about just for like in the postseason when you're facing like a tough righty. I don't know if you're gonna have Pollock in the lineup. It would be better to have Joc in a case like that.
And Joc had 2 home runs and a 990 OPS. Exactly. So he's a guy who's produced in the postseason. We saw like a guy with Rich Hill. The Dodgers were willing to pay up for a guy that they knew could produce at that moment. Joc could be one of those guys. Third on the list as far as Dodger free agents, the only guy to make the top 50 aside from Turner and Peterson was Blake Trinen. Now, I'll be honest. I had a friend text me, who do you want the most? Trinen is actually the guy I like the most. Yeah. I was surprised to see him below Joc Pederson personally. But Trynan, they've got as the 29th best free agent. They've got him signing a 2-year, $14 million deal. This coming after, I believe he signed a 1-year, $10 million deal with the Dodgers this past offseason. For me, this is the one I would say yes to. I'm a big Blake Trynan guy. You and I both, I think, thought he was the most trustworthy reliever they had. I joked with Matt, and I'll ask you the same question. They used Trynan 3 days in a row, 3 different times. And I said, that's one of 2 things. A, they trust him more than they trust anyone else. Or B, we're going to freaking redline the crap out of your arm because you're going to be gone a la Brandon Morrow. Which do you foresee? Yeah. Do you think that was, hey, we know you're not going to be here next year, so peace? Or was that, hey, we just trust you the most and we need these outs?
I think it was a mixture of both.
Yeah.
I think there's no question they trusted him the most. Dave Roberts even said that they had gone to him 3 days in a row multiple times during the season, whereas not a single other reliever in the bullpen had done that even once. So he felt comfortable doing that with him. But I also think it's a case of Brandon Morrow where they're probably going to get him and let him walk, right? Like he's probably 2 years, 14 mil seems honestly pretty team friendly. I was expecting that number to be higher.
Yeah.
If that's what it is, I would love for the Dodgers to bring him back. But I mean, he had, his ERA and stats like that weren't all that great this year. But for those of us that watched every single game, like you just said, we had him as probably the most trustworthy reliever in that bullpen. So he kind of regained some of his stock that he lost last offseason after a rough 2019. So I'm expecting him to get paid elsewhere. I think the Dodgers will do what they typically do with the bullpen, maybe dumpster dive a little bit,
Yeah.
maybe bring in one other guy who had a similar season this year to Trynan's 2019 that they could kind of make, their reclamation project. But I mean, if it's only 2 years, 14 million for Trynan, I would love to have him back at that.
Well, and I mean, I would just say I think it's going to be lower than that. I mean, if Brad Hand can't get 1 year for $10 million, like Trynan is not going to get 7. Like if Brad Hand is going to be lucky to sign that deal, 214, that means Trynan's probably going to be in the 210 or maybe like 1.6 range, and so. We'll see how that plays out. And then they might like other guys more. There's a couple guys we'll mention in a little bit, but
yeah, definitely.
And just for what it's worth, I believe they have Peterson and Trynan both projected to leave MLB trade rumors. I think they have Trynan to the Marlins, maybe Peterson to like the Cardinals or someone like that. Somebody that needs outfield help.
Yeah, that's exactly who they had.
So the other names on this list, Jake Mcgee was an honorable mention. Baez, Wood, and Kike were not listed. Of those 4, you've talked about Kike. I could see the same. I could see the Dodgers liking him. We had a question from or Mikey Alvarado on Instagram posted, we asked for questions. He just said, hey, we need to keep Kike. The Dodgers need that wild and funny side. I tend to agree. Yep. I think Kike is going to be pretty affordable. Maybe there's a team that really loves him, but like you've said, fantastic defensively, which the Dodgers definitely value, versatility, which they value, and he is, a bat that crushes lefties, which hasn't necessarily always been a strength of the Dodgers. I could see if there's not a team that's wanting to go overpay him a little, but I could see him signing a smaller deal. I like Jake Mcgee. I mean, sabermetrics like Jake Mcgee. He had one of the highest strikeout percentages in all of baseball. Matt and I couldn't figure out for the life of us why he pitched as little as he did in the postseason.
Yeah, me neither.
Because they were using him in high leverage situations all throughout. So if he's a guy that's not even in the top 50, that feels like a guy that maybe you just bring back. I know they're not desperate for left-handed help now that they've got a guy like Victor Gonzalez. But Mcgee throws hard. He's got the spin rate. He's kind of everything the Dodgers tend to like. So that leaves with Baez and Wood. Those feel like the 2 most likely to leave. I would put Baez, Wood, and Joc Pederson as the 3 guys that I have just all assumed. I mean, I think they were waiting for Alex Wood's contract to be done with. But those 3 guys, I think they were just more than happy. I mean, Baez, he got the changeup. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. I guess Wood, I think, is gone. Peterson, I think, is gone. Baez and Mcgee are in that kind of maybe range. Kike, throw it in there. And then I would want Trynan and Turner. How do you feel about Mcgee, Baez, Wood, and you mentioned Kike already?
Yeah. For me, I'm with you. Jake McGee's the one guy out of that group I'd probably look to bring back. I was in the same boat where I wasn't really sure why he wasn't pitching the postseason. Maybe it's because he basically only throws fastballs, but I mean, he got people out with that all year. He had one of the highest strikeout rates on the team. So, I mean, that's a guy, like you said, though, that left-handed relief pitching isn't a huge need, but I mean, he came in and got outs, and you could probably get him for cheap this winter. So that's the guy I'd probably go after. Alex Wood, I think he'll be gone. I mean, huge credit to him. He had a couple big outings down the stretch in the postseason there. Might have even earned himself some money with those outings. So credit to him. But he's made it clear that he wants to start, and I just don't think that's going to happen on the Dodgers. They got too much starting depth. He wouldn't even figure into the mix. So I think he's gone. And Baez, I don't know. We'll see. It depends. I guess it just depends on the reliever market, right? Like he's definitely not top tier, but he's also pretty good. Like if you look at his stats over the years with the Dodgers, he has a good year pretty much every year. And like there's a lot of teams who could use that in their bullpen. Like we saw the Marlins pick up Yimi Garcia last year, and he actually had a really great year for them. Whereas all Dodger fans, hated him, and rightfully so a lot of the time. So I ultimately think Baez will be gone, but it also wouldn't shock me if he doesn't have a huge market and the Dodgers bring him back.
Yeah, because I mean, there's certain positions, right, where teams might just say we're not spending on this position. Like, in this year we're not spending on our 7th inning relief guy. We're not spending on our utility guy. And so that's where Kike and Baez might be hurt financially, but might benefit the Dodgers. And I think, too, the Dodgers have valued clubhouse camaraderie and that kind of thing. And so what you're getting in Baez. He's comfortable there. The guys seem to like him. Kike obviously fits that bill. And so I could definitely see those guys kind of coming back. But as you think about that, one other thing that for the longest time I never thought of, but is important to note, the 40-man roster. One thing about the Dodgers that has made them as good as they are is the depth that they create. and the development and the farm system and the drafting and how good they are, all those things. Well, if there's one quote unquote downside to all of that, it's that at some point you can only protect 40 guys on the 40-man roster. Now, some of the younger guys, they're not eligible to be taken on the Rule 5 draft or any of that by another team, but you start piling up these assets, you start piling up these utility guys, these relievers, that kind of thing. Well, at some point you run out of room. So as it stands, the Dodgers only have 8 openings on their 40-man roster. In addition to the 8 guys we mentioned, Terrence Gore was also let go, reassigned to minor league camp. David Price was added to the roster. I think you might have mentioned on Twitter. It'll be curious to see if David Price, will he pitch next year if COVID is just as bad? So that's something, but he does take up a spot. So there's currently 8 spots, remaining. But you have to remember, there's this thing called the Rule 5 draft where basically once a guy has been in your system for a certain number of years, if he is not on your 40-man roster, another team can draft him in the Rule 5 draft with the rule being that person then has to stay on their major league roster for the entire next season. If they are sent down or optioned, they come right back to the Dodgers. Our friend Justin Lorber, Future Dodgers on Twitter, he's got a list of about 7 guys that he'd like to see protected, kind of 3 guys at the top and then 4 guys after. So just something to keep in mind as we go into talking about free agents. If they sign Turner, that means 7 spots. If they sign Trynan, that means 6 spots. If they sign Mcgee, they've only got 5 spots left on the 40-man roster, not to mention Rule 5, not to mention any free agents they might want to pursue. Just something to keep in mind. But that leads to kind of the big picture question now that we've gotten all of that out of the way. The Dodgers are World Series champs. What's your offseason plan, Daniel? I mean, you look at that list, and it's pretty amazing because you're only really losing Turner as far as contributors offensively. Obviously, right. Kike's a little bit of a piece there. You're losing a couple, none of your, I guess Trynan's sort of your 8th inning guy, and then you're losing a couple 7th inning guys. So for a World Series team to be bringing everyone back, I mean, on paper, they're going to be better with all of the young guys that they have who should only improve. What's your overall offseason plan? Where would you focus your attention if you were Andrew Friedman and the Dodgers?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's essentially all on pitching.
Okay.
The Dodgers lineup and even their bench are great. And if you bring Justin Turner back, if you let Justin Turner go, then you need to find a replacement at third base. But if you bring him back, it's not like there's a position where you need to find a guy to come in and start. Yeah. So I'm not really looking at too many position players, especially Gavin Lux is a guy who's still a consensus top 5 prospect in baseball. And, who knows what he could have done this year if he didn't get off to, when he got off to a slow start. He reported to camp late and then just didn't look like himself. Yeah. So, I mean, if he comes out next year and has a great spring, he could very well earn the starting second baseman job. So I think the lineup and the bench are just fine. Yeah. So I would look towards pitching if you're trying to make upgrades. And for me, it starts in the starting rotation. We saw the Dodgers have 3 really great starters in Kershaw, Buehler, and Julio. So now you're just seeing how you fill out the rest of that rotation. Obviously, Dustin May and Tony Gonsolin were both great in the regular season, not quite as reliable in the postseason. So I guess a lot of it depends on David Price. Like you just said, we don't really know what he plans to do, right? A lot of people just assume oh, this season's over, we get David Price back next year. But the pandemic hasn't really slowed down. So if it's a similar situation when March rolls around to what it was this year, then why would he play? What changed that he would all of a sudden come back and play? He just sat out and watched his team win the World Series. So why would he change anything? Obviously, he has a family, so you got to keep that in mind. He wants to look out for them, and I respect his decision if he doesn't come back. But if he doesn't come back, then you probably have to add a starter. And it's tricky because he might not tell you until next March, so you might not know this offseason. But, I mean, we'll get into some of the free agents outside the Dodgers organization. But for me, I would look to add a starter and then a back of the bullpen reliever that can maybe even close games. We're not exactly sure what Kenley's going to be moving forward. We're not sure if Gratterall is going to take the next step and become, a full-time closer. So if you could get a guy, whether it's Trynan or a guy similar to Trynan, who could either pitch the 9th or get high leverage outs, That would be huge. So I think those are the two things for me that I would look to be adding is, a starter and a reliever.
Yeah, the starter is interesting, right? Because you look at it right now, you've got Kershaw, you've got Bueller, you've got Urias, you've got Gonsolin, you've got May, you've got Price, you've got Josiah Gray kind of waiting in the wings,
Right.
you've got Dennis
Right.
Santana on the roster. So that's the interesting piece to me is whether or not the Dodgers actually would go. Because by the way, I'll mention Brusdar Graterol was not always penciled in to be a reliever. This is a guy that they had hoped to be a starter. So do they try and stretch him out next year? Or do they look at the performance and the velocity and say, we're actually going to groom you to be our ninth inning guy for the next decade? I don't know, but I wouldn't personally necessarily prioritize a starter. Obviously, we're going to talk about a guy, Trevor Bauer, in just a moment, who's kind of the number one guy on the list. And maybe you would agree with me in this. Outside of him, I'm not interested in a starting pitcher. If I can get somebody of his quality, I mean, basically outside of Bauer, I don't think you're going to get anybody that's enough of an upgrade that would stunt the growth of Urias, Gonsolin, or May. Or, I mean, which I actually kind of like taking my chances with the Dennis Santana, taking my chances with the Josiah Gray when he's ready, and just letting some of those guys breathe a little bit. So I think for me, the focus would entirely be on the bullpen. You said we don't know what we're going to get out of Jansen. I'm afraid we do know what we're going to get out of Jansen, and it's not going to be good. And even Graterol's nice, but he wasn't striking anybody out, so he's not missing the bats that you want in the ninth. Victor Gonzalez is really, really good, but it's a small sample size. You don't necessarily pencil him in to be the closer. So if it's me, you saw the way that this postseason played out. I think you're glad your bullpen kind of survived, but you also saw some holes in that group. I would bring a guy like Trynan back, but he would not be the best arm that I added there, whether it's via trade, which we'll talk about in a little bit on a mailbag question, or whether it's via the free agent market, especially with how cheap those arms are going to be. If a guy like Brad Hand is not even getting signed by any team for 1 year, $10 million, not because nobody's interested, but because they're like, forget it, we can sign this guy for less. To me, I would prioritize that. I'm with you on the bats. I think you can't sign a hitter because you need to find at bats for Gavin Lux. You need to find at bats for Edwin Rios, Michael Busch, Zach McKinstry, like a bunch of these guys. There's plenty more. So offensively, if it's Turner, great. And if it's not Turner, then I think you leave things alone and go from there. So let's talk about some of the names. The biggest name, the number one free agent that's out there is Trevor Bauer. He's actually projected to the Dodgers by MLB Trade Rumors. 4 years,
a bold projection,
4 years, $128 million. So 4 years at $32 million per. Your thoughts on the Dodgers potentially signing Trevor Bauer and then those numbers?
Bauer is interesting. I mean, we all know he's a polarizing figure, right? Like you either love him or you hate him.
Yeah.
But there's no denying what he did this past season. He's probably going to win the NL Cy Young. He had a great year. And we saw down the stretch, he was even pitching on willingly pitching on 3 days rest and was still great. And he was great in the postseason. He won 8 shutout against a good Braves offense. Yeah. So to me, he's, like you said, he's the only real game changer among starting pitchers in this free agent class. If I had to guess, I'd say the Dodgers aren't going to be breaking the bank for him. He's probably going to be getting in the neighborhood of $30 million a year. That's kind of right on par with the projection had.
Yeah.
We're not really sure how long of a contract he's going to be willing to sign. He's said his whole career he just wants to do 1 year deals.
He's backed off that a little bit. He said, "Hey, I'm open to long term." Yeah. But he has said for the longest time, "I want 1 year deals."
Yeah, so I mean, a short-term deal will definitely play into the Dodgers' favor. Yeah. But if he's looking for a longer-term deal now, anything longer than 4 years, I don't think the Dodgers would be willing to give that to him. Like you said, they got plenty of guys they're going to need to pay in the coming future with Seager and Bueller and Bellinger and all those guys. Yeah. So I don't think they want to tie up, money to someone as good as Bauer. But if he's willing to sign like a 2 year deal, like 2 years, $70 million or something.
Yeah.
I think that would be very intriguing because that's another ace to add to that rotation. And I mean, 2 years from now, I think that's when we would see the next wave of those Dodgers starters.
Yeah.
At least entering the picture for a postseason mix. I don't know next year how many of those guys will be, able to count on to get October starts. So if Bauer's willing to do a 1 or 2 year deal, I definitely think the Dodgers should jump on that. Anything longer than that, they'll stay away, though.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because he's not a popular guy in a lot of clubhouses, and the Dodgers value that. They prioritize that. Now, that they made Harper an offer, and Harper's another pretty polarizing guy. Different. I think Bauer is the most polarizing in a
Yeah.
unique way, not because, whatever, for his own reasons. He's fascinating.
Yeah.
I read today he thinks he wants to start on 4 days. He thinks he can be the first guy to make 40 starts in a year. So that's fascinating. I do think the short-term deal would be interesting. But here's the question I keep coming back to. Are the Dodgers really going to sign Trevor Bauer and take starts away from Tony Gonsolin or Dustin May or Julio Urias? Because it's like, yes, obviously he makes them better. Obviously, we just saw the value of starting pitching in the postseason. Probably we swung back to like, oh yeah, it's nice to have guys that can actually eat innings and make starts. But like at some point, it's a numbers crunch. It was one thing when they were doing this to Ross Stripling, a guy that we were like, yeah, he's fine. Like he's fine. Right. But to do it to a guy like Gonsolin, who's been great, to a guy like May, who's been great, this is assuming David Price comes back next year. To me, it just feels like, I don't know. I just wonder if because of the clubhouse thing and then because of the cost against some of your younger arms, I wonder if those two stop this from ever becoming even a negotiation.
Yeah, that's definitely a fair point. I think, though, if it's for a game changer like Bauer, then you do it. I wouldn't do it for just some random Joe Schmo. But if you could get a game changer, maybe you could, maybe trade Gonsolin or May and address another need. Obviously, I wouldn't want to do that. I love both those guys and I'm very high on them going into the future. But it's definitely a possibility. Those guys have probably pretty high trade value right now, coming off the seasons they just had. So. But like you said, Bauer, he's very polarizing. I don't know if they want to add him to that clubhouse. We've seen with the Dodgers, they like giving their starters extra days of rest, not fewer days. So I don't think if he came here, I would not expect him to be pitching on 3 days rest, even if he thinks he can. There's just too much of an injury risk to be doing that in April and May for a team that's going to win 100 games regardless. So, I would be pretty surprised if they signed Bauer, to be honest, but I wouldn't be mad about it.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. And he's a driveline guy. The Dodgers are obviously very plugged in there, so that would help as well. But I think, like a 270, if you could get somewhere there, because then, nobody's going to sign you to a 4-year deal and let you pitch every 4 days. Like, it's just not going to happen. They signed you to a 1-year deal, maybe, but not the Dodgers. So we kind of mentioned, Bauer's sort of in a class of his own. Let me read you the next 9 guys as far as the top 10. JT Realmuto, the Dodgers obviously don't need a catcher. George Springer, hard pass. Marcelo Ozuna, DJ LeMahieu, Marcus Stroman, Ha-Sung Kim, KBO guy, my guy, Korean baseball, 25-year-old shortstop. Most people say he'd be pretty much in the top 100 prospects, so he's an interesting one that some people have connected the Dodgers to, not because they need a shortstop, but because it's basically a prospect that you can go and buy. Didi Gregorius, your boy Kevin Gausman, and then Tanaka from the Yankees as well. So Gausman actually not on here because, the Giants have already, I guess they haven't locked him up. They made the qualifying offer. Everybody else is cost-cutting amazing players, and the Giants are giving Gausman like a 1-year, $19 million deal. So shout out to them. But I'll throw 2 more names at you that I think are interesting. Liam Hendrix, who is from the A's, and Brad Hand. Those two are 2 of the best relievers in all of baseball. Hendrix is 32 in February, had a 1.79 ERA, 13.1 strikeout per 9 in his last 110 innings since 2019. So basically 2019, 2020, he has been the most valuable, according to WAR, reliever in all of baseball. He is a free agent because the A's released him. Brad Hand turns 31 in March. In 2020, he had a 2.05 ERA, one of the top 22nd in all of baseball. He had a 33.7 strikeout percentage, 18th in baseball, 4.7 walk percentage, 11th in baseball. The velocity is ticking down, but this is a guy who has been consistently great. Brad Hand could have been had for 1 year's $10 million. Anybody that wanted him, nobody wanted him. So let me ask, Hendrix might sniff that number, but that's probably the very, very high end you're looking at for a reliever. Either of those guys interesting to you? What kind of money would you be interested in for those 2?
Yeah, it's hard not to be interested in Liam Hendrix. He's been one of the best relievers in baseball the last 2 years. He's been a closer, so he's shown he could save games. He's shown in October he could pitch multiple innings. So that's the one guy I'd probably be willing to spend, big money on, or big money. Like it's relievers we're
Yeah.
talking about, so it's not Trevor Bauer
He's
money,
projected
but
at 3 years, $30 million is the MLB
yeah,
trade rumors
I would be
projection.
fine doing that for Hendrix. 3 years is not too long term. Like obviously it's not 1 or 2 years, but we're like Joe Kelly signed 3 years,
Oh,
and we're
gosh.
already 2 years of that. So I mean, it's not
Hallelujah.
too bad. Like if it doesn't work out, so that's the one guy I'd look to
Joe
sign. I'm
Kelly
not
might be a
crazy
bad
about.
comp there because we're 2 years into Joe Kelly, and I'd say it's been a pretty rough two years.
Right, but what I mean is it's almost over.
Fair,
Like
fair,
we only got one more year. It's not like we're sitting through 3 more years of it.
fair.
So, but yeah, I'm not huge on Brad Hand. He, like you said, he's been dominant the last few years, but he's also his velocity's dropped
Yeah,
um, year by year the last like 3 years, and he's getting up there. He's over 30 now. He's 30 or 31,
turns
somewhere in that
31.
range.
Yeah,
So yeah. And we've talked about the lefties the Dodgers have. They got Victor Gonzalez and Scott Alexander, and Caleb Ferguson will be
oh,
back
that's right.
eventually,
It's a
probably
name we
not
haven't
this year.
mentioned.
Yeah, probably he won't be back in 2021, but that's a name for 2022. So I'm not crazy about Brad Hand. I think someone else will probably give him 2 years or 20 million or whatever. I don't know. I mean, no one picked him up for 10 mil, but it's different when you got teams bidding.
Yeah.
So I'm not crazy about Brad Hand, but Liam Hendricks, if they could get him for 330 like he's projected, that would be a big get right there.
Yeah, I mean, because I think the Dodgers have a hole at the back end of their bullpen, and it's not to say that they're
Yeah.
going to go the traditional closer route, but they definitely don't have more than anybody that you can just pencil into that spot.
Right.
Kenley Jansen's just not that guy anymore, and so Hendricks is far and away the best free agent available to fill that. Are there any other free agents? I mean, for me, there's not really any other names. I mean, you could dumpster diving, as you put it. I could see the Dodgers for sure doing that,
Yeah.
picking up a starter, converting him to a reliever for basically no money, that kind of thing. Any other names that you like on the free agent market, even at the lower end?
Yeah, I have one name in mind. It would add some starting pitching depth. There's a left-hander who's a free agent who he pitched for the Minnesota Twins last year. We know him real well. He goes by the name of Dick Mountain. He's 40 years old, but he still had a pretty good year last year. He made 8 starts with the Twins, had a 3.03 ERA. So if you could bring him in on a 1-year deal for cheap, we know how much he loves the Dodgers. We know he fits in this clubhouse. We know he's not always going to be healthy, but he could provide some valuable depth. He's still got it. No matter how much everyone wants, or I mean, no one wants, but everyone expects him to just retire at this point. He's still got it. I think he's still got 1 more year left in him, 1 more championship run left in him. So I would bring back Rich Hill, nice little 1-year deal, maybe 2 or 3 million, and add him to the back of that starting rotation.
Yeah, I mean, that's a guy too. He would be the natural swing guy, right? Where it's like you could just make him your long reliever, and he could throw hard, and he's got the curveball. I mean, we've seen the breaking stuff can be pretty effective out of the bullpen. So that would be I hadn't thought about that name, but there you go. I didn't know. I was like, where the heck is he going with this? But Rich Hill, there you go. Well, let me ask you this: as far as sort of on the off-season roster, Ralph likes the Dodgers from Instagram sent us this question: would you trade Gavin Lux for a bullpen beast? Now, I'll amend this question because I don't think Gavin Lux is the guy going to be traded. I think you look at the Dodgers infield and you see a hole at second base. You see a potential hole at shortstop if they ever do move Corey Seager over. You've got Edwin Rios in the mix, etc. So I don't think it would be Lux, but I think a name like Keibert Ruiz could possibly be on the trading block because of Will Smith and Austin Barnes as well, how they have played. And they've got Diego Cartaya, who's probably the best catching prospect of the whole bunch, potentially. You mentioned there's sort of an excess of starting pitching. Maybe a guy like Gonzalez available for trade. I don't think they would trade Dustin May, but May they probably see as a potential number 1, number 2, number 3 starter, whereas Gonzalez they probably projecting more as a 3-4, so he might be a little more available. But would you make a trade of one of those guys for a bullpen name? And I'll just throw it out. I mean, 2 of the names that I saw mentioned pitch for the Milwaukee Brewers, which are Josh Hader and Williams, blanking on his first name right now, but Devin Williams. I mean, those 2 are elite guys. So for me, I wouldn't trade Lux, but if you could package a guy like Keibert Ruiz and bring back a guy like Josh Hader, which, speaking of clubhouse potential problems, although by all accounts, since his teenage Twitter stuff, which was reprehensible and inexcusable and unacceptable, he has seemingly turned things around, said all the right things this past year, doesn't seem to be a guy that is hated in his clubhouse. So I would be very interested in something around a Keibert Ruiz for Josh Hader type move.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think Lux is going anywhere. I mean, as bad as a year as he had this year, it's important to remember he's still like a consensus top 5
Yeah.
prospect in baseball. Still has a very bright future ahead of him. He's only 22, so I don't think he's going anywhere. I think he'll be competing for this starting second base job next spring. Ruiz is definitely an interesting name. Like you said, the Dodgers have Will Smith and Austin Barnes is still under contract, and Diego Cartaya is not far behind. He's only 19, but he's probably 2-3 years away.
Yeah.
And with Will Smith back there, that's totally fine. So there's not really a set role for Keibert Ruiz, at least this next season, maybe the year after. So I think that's definitely a guy they could look to trade. And Josh Hader would not be a bad arm to add to the back of that bullpen. So yeah, if they could get a deal done like that, I'd be totally fine with it. I'm not huge on trading the farm for relievers. That's just never something I've
Yeah.
liked. Relievers are so volatile that you never know what you're going to get for them year to year. So I'm not huge on trading for relievers, but I feel like Josh Hader is one of the few
Yeah.
elite arms in this league that's been consistently great the last few years. And he's still young too, and he's still got a few years left of club control. So if they could do a deal like that, I definitely would be interested.
Yeah, it would have to be a guy like at the Hader level, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah, exactly.
and he's, I mean,
Exactly.
when we faced the Brewers, I said he terrified me still. And so
Yeah.
to be able to plug him into the back of the rotation or the back, and again, that's a cost saving feature as well, because you're getting a guy who's still discounted. Obviously, he's getting closer, if not already in arbitration. So, but it's going to be a lot less than having to go out and spend on the free agency market. And as you said, I mean, Keibert Ruiz is a really good player, but he's at least a year away from being the backup catcher based on how Austin Barnes just performed, unless the Dodgers
Right.
try and trade Austin Barnes, which, hey, I wouldn't necessarily totally rule out, because they probably,
Mhm.
if they're not going to trade Ruiz, they need to figure out something for him. But
Yeah.
yeah, that will definitely be interesting. I mean, is there any, we mentioned a couple of guys maybe trading out some of the excess starting pitching, a guy like Dennis Santana, someone like that I could see being moved. Any other names that you would sort of put out on the radar of, hey, you never know about moving a guy like this?
Yeah, I mean, Mitch White is a guy who we've heard his name as one of the top prospects in the organization for a while now. I think he came up once or twice
Yeah.
this season, didn't really pitch a whole lot, but he's a guy who projects as a starting pitcher, probably may not ever get that opportunity with the Dodgers, whereas he could, in theory, he's major league ready. So in theory, he could be in someone's rotation opening day next year.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't be surprised to see a team try and go after a guy like him in a package type deal. So that's a guy I think they could move. Dennis Santana is another one who hasn't really panned out the way the Dodgers had hoped. Still really young, but he doesn't really look like a future member of the rotation. So that's a guy they could look to
Yeah.
move as well. Josiah Gray, I feel like, is probably their only untouchable
Yeah.
guy that they're not really looking to move. I don't know if he'll be major league ready in 2021, maybe towards the end of the year. But yeah, I mean, I don't think they're in a rush to really trade starting pitching depth. We know how much this
Yeah.
organization values starting pitching depth and how much they put it to use during the regular season just because of injuries or just wanting to give extra guys extra days or whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
So I don't think they're going to be in a rush to trade starting pitchers, but if they do, I think Mitch White is probably the most likely of that bunch to get moved.
Yeah, and I mean, him and Santana are good names because it thinks that would be a way to, hey, trade a guy who's close to major league ready, open up a spot on the 40 man in exchange for a prospect who's
Exactly.
19. Basically the same thing they did with Ross Stripling,
Right.
which that sounds like they got an unbelievable haul in exchange for Ross Stripling. But
Yeah.
those types of moves, I think we could see. So absolutely. Well, let me get you out of here on one last question. This is from our friend Adrian Lopez, and shout out to Adrian Lopez because you asked us a bunch of questions on Instagram, most of which we already addressed. What should they do about Turner, that kind of thing. Adrian Lopez wants to know, Daniel, should the Dodgers get a new manager?
We're still asking these questions, huh? I mean, they won it all, so I'm just gonna flat out say no, it's not happening. And probably even if they lose next year and Dave Roberts makes a bunch of mistakes, it's probably not happening next year
Yeah.
either. Now that he won it all and got the monkey off his back, so I think it's time we just put those talks to rest. Dave Roberts is the manager of this team. He's gonna be the manager of this team for a very long time. And I think he does everything other than the bullpen management. I feel like he does everything pretty well as a
Yeah.
manager. Everyone, all the guys in that clubhouse love him.
Yep.
He's very good at managing personalities. He's good at getting guys to accept their roles. Like there's so much talent in this organization that there's so many guys that could very well be starting and playing every day, but they accept lesser roles on the Dodgers, and that's a huge credit to Dave Roberts. So no, they're not moving away from Dave Roberts anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned on our last one, I think Roberts, he deserves to get crushed. You and I absolutely crushed him in the post game for the way he handled Game 4 of the World Series. Aside from that, he was fantastic. I mean, the decision to leave Urias in for Game 7 of the NLCS and then to leave him in for Game 6 of the World Series, both were not no-brainers, not easy decisions. He navigated the bullpen in Game 6, by the way, perfectly. Every string he pulled worked. And just something as simple as to take a team that went down 3-1 in the NLCS and came back, to take a team that endured the loss in Game 4 of the World Series that they did and come back to win Game 5. Those are things that, yes, you should credit Justin Turner and Mookie Betts and Clayton Kershaw and leadership, but that starts with Dave Roberts. I mean, you can't quantify it, but that happens and is a reflection directly of the manager. The team did not quit. The team did not roll over. So credit to Roberts. And again, we're going to remember Game 4 in part for right now, but he was fantastic for 4 rounds of postseason baseball for the Dodgers. I'm not saying he always has been. You and I have been critics of his, but I think he got an A. It wasn't an A+, but he got an A, and the Dodgers won the World Series. So no, Dave Roberts will not be leaving the Dodgers anytime soon to begin with.
Unbelievable.
So there you go. There you have it. We appreciate you joining us. We'll be back throughout the offseason, periodically checking in, answering questions. So be sure to send us to those. We're on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter at DodgerBlue1958, same as YouTube, DodgerBlue1958 as well. Subscribe there. DodgerBlue.com is the best place to check out all the offseason news as some of these decisions are made about free agents, whether for the Dodgers or elsewhere around the league. We'll have all that there. So check that out. Daniel is at D Starkand on Twitter. I probably butchered the pronunciation of that, so I apologize.
No, that was good enough.
There you go. Okay, I'm at Jeff Spiegel on Twitter. We appreciate you joining us. Enjoy the rest of your week. And remember, still champs!